Franklin Roosevelt made that speech in Hyde Park in 1920. In 10 years, he would master radio like no one before or since. But the first chief executive to have a radio at his command was Harding. And his rhetoric and pear-shaped tones went over very well with the listeners. And so did just about everything else in that balmy Prohibition era. In June of 1923, he made a speech in St. Louis that was heard in Washington and New York at the same time. Just imagine that.
America's present need is not heroic, but healing. Not nostrums, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration. Not agitation, but adjustment. Not surgery, but serenity. Not the dramatic, but the dispassionate.
In November 23, Woodrow Wilson spoke to a radio audience. He reminded the nation of Armistice Day. He was a dying man at that time, but 4 stations carried his voice.
Retrieve that fatal hour and resume once more the role of courage, self-respect, and helpfulness.
1924 was an election year, and no one who heard that Democratic Convention broadcast from Madison Square Garden in New York will ever forget it. The convention was deeply divided over prohibition, religion, regionalism, and 100 other issues, and it went on and on and on. There was fighting, music, screaming, prayers, and oratory. Loudspeakers carried the sounds to the streets, and radio shops carried it to every neighborhood in New York City. You know, only 2 men did the announcing. Think of it. Phillips Carlin and Graham McNamee. After 103 ballots, I think every man, woman, and child in America had heard this phrase.
Alabama cast 24 votes for Oscar W. Underwood.
But it was all for naught, because silent Calvin Coolidge got in anyway. And he was a big success on the radio, don't forget that. Because his flat voice didn't tax the carbon microphones, and his position was hard to beat.
I believe in the American Constitution. I favor the American system of individual enterprise, and I am opposed to any general extension of government ownership and control. I believe not only in advocating economy and public expenditure, but in its practical application and actual accomplishment. I am opposed to...
One of the things that I look back on with great satisfaction, because I played some part in it, was the bringing of the Coolidge inaugural to Los Angeles.
This is Carl Haviland, who was the commercial manager of KFI in Los Angeles.
We went to the Board of Education, asked the Board of Education to allow us to put through the offices of the Radio Trades Association, the dealers and distributors in broadcast equipment, into every school in the Los Angeles School District and explain the importance of an inaugural address. That was one of the most dramatic things that ever happened in our area. Radio had been a toy, quote, unquote, underlined capital letters. Nobody paid too much attention to it. It was an amusing thing. But when the solemn ceremonies came over those lines into those classrooms, after the teachers had explained its importance, radio came of age in our area. And I'm sure it happened elsewhere in the country because we were not the only station that took this.
I'd like you to hear from a young man who made quite a name for himself in radio later on. He recalls the early days vividly. His name, Red Barber.
One of the strongest, earliest memories I ever have is as a boy in Central Florida, listening to the radio in the living room of a classmate of mine, and this would be 1924, at one of the stations that he would bring in through the hepzidinining and the squealing and the twisting and turning of dials and knobs, etc. It wasn't an easy thing to listen to radio in those days. And I remember that you didn't have much foot-room because you had so many batteries around on the floor. All radio was run off batteries in those days, and you had recharges for batteries, and you had red lights on the recharge, and it was almost like setting up a laboratory the way Merrill Roberts had it. But we used to bring in KDKA. And then you'd bring in WSB in Atlanta. And my gracious, what a triumph it would be if we could hear Kansas City or hear a station in Chicago. I think that the young people today who just pick up a transistor radio and your only problem is which one of a number of local stations to tune into have no idea of the excitement that hit this country when radio was young.
You know, so much broadcasting history was written before 1928. It seems incredible today. But in the 1920s, radio was a hotly debated issue in Congress. It was written about. It was joked about. Perhaps even more than it is today when we take it all for granted. Why, I even wrote a book about it, called I Looked and I Listened, which was drawn from my years as a radio listener and reviewer. I remember the Scopes trial, the Monkey trial, which was broadcast in 1925. I remember the early days at WHN in New York, when we used to tell stories on the air, unrehearsed, just to keep the station going when the piano player didn't show up. I recall the very first program for children, which were just stories read by a reporter who was told to keep on talking till they could find another singer. I got my job as a radio reviewer for the New York Daily News because the regular radio man decided that it wouldn't last. Oh, we had a hell of a time keeping that old receiver in working order. And if I have to pick one incident to close with, I'll talk about the evangelist, Amy Semple Mcpherson. You know, she actually owned a radio station in Los Angeles, and in those days, the stations shared a frequency with other local stations. So there was a lot of interference, and each one broadcast for so many allotted hours during the day or night on one wavelength. Incredible, isn't it? Well, Sister Amy permitted the station to wander off a frequency to another frequency where the reception was better. And finally, Secretary Hoover asked her not to change her wavelength. So she sent him a telegram. Please order your minions of Satan to leave my station alone. You can't expect the Almighty to abide by your wavelength nonsense. When I offer my prayers to Him, I must fit it into His wave reception. Well, Sister Amy decided the listeners came first, and she finally agreed to stay on her own frequency. And once more, this voice was heard.
Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Come, come, come. Like chiming bells at eveningtide, this word rings out all through the Bible. Come in Genesis. Come.
Evening, friends, family. Pardon me, ladies and gentlemen. This is station OUCH of the New Writers Broadcasting Company, pardon me again, operating on a wavelength of 600 motorcycles by the authority of the Federal Prohibition Agent. The first number on the program for this evening will be rendered, to be rendered meaning to be torn apart, by the Silent Dozen Orchestra. They will play as the opening selection, People Who Live in Glass Houses Shouldn't.
That lovely parody of radio's early years was recorded just about the time I first started in broadcasting. I'm Jimmy Wallington, and I got my first job as an announcer in radio in 1928.
New York. We will now give you the correct time. When you hear the beautiful chime, it will be exactly 6 7/8 split seconds past 8 o'clock. Eastern Daylight Standard Railroad.
In its
Western
earliest
Mountain
years,
Central
radio
Time.
had a wonderful
Get
kind of
ready now.
spontaneity
Listen for
because
the
no one
time.
planned the programs very far ahead, and only a few stations were on the air all day long. They shared the day with other stations on the same wavelength. Here's the story of how one young fella got started on radio. Later on, he would become a staff announcer for CBS, and then the suave MC of your Lucky Strike hit parade, Andre Baruch.
My first appearance in radio, strangely enough, was down in Coney Island. And I was walking along the boardwalk with a friend of mine. We came to the Half Moon Hotel, and on the boardwalk itself was a storefront. And it had the call letters WCGU. And at this point, a man came out and said, frantically, "Can anybody here do anything?" And he pointed to me, my friend, and said, "He can play piano." And the man practically grabbed me by the back of the neck, threw me into this room, sat me down at the piano, and the room was entirely walled in by these velvet drapes. He then walked to this big carbon microphone, turned on a switch, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we now present that distinguished concert pianist, Paul Hart." And I turned around to see who that was, you know. And then he flipped a switch, and he said, "What are you going to play?" And I said, "Dizzy Fingers." He said, "No, you have to play something classical." Mr. Hart opens his concert this afternoon with...
Say, Bill, shall we sing that crazy porcupine song?
Yes, Ernest, I just feel crazy enough to sing it.
Then we'll both be crazy. All right, Dave. Porcupines are all full of quills. Kiss them and you'll sure to get thrilled. Weeping willows like to weep, just like I weep for you. As a porcupine pines for its fork, that's how I'll pine for you.
That's Billy Jones and Ernie Hare. And I think they were radio's first superstars. They first appeared on WJZ back in 1921, and after radio began to have sponsored shows, they were very much in demand for their song and patter. They did commercials for the Interwoven Sock Company.
How do you do, everybody? How do you do? Gee, it's great to say hello to all of you. I'm Billy Jones. I'm Ernie Hare. We're the Interwoven Bear. How do you do,
The Tasty Loaf Bakery.
How do you do, everybody? How do you do? Going on with Jones and Hare to all of you. We're Interlopers now, it's best representing tasty bread. How do you do?
And the Happiness Candy Company.
We two boys without a care entertain you folks out there. That's our happiness. Just to know the things we do make us feel we're pleasing you. That's our happiness.
Back about 1923 or 24, we arranged for a full-page advertisement in the New York Herald Tribune that WOR proudly announces in conjunction or in cooperation with the New York University a series of cultural programs in the arts, literature, and so forth.
This is Jack Popley, one of radio's real pioneers and WOR's first chief engineer.
The program was well prepared. Professors of the various departments came from New York over to Newark because we were still over in Newark and we were not in New York at the time. Well, we thought that we had accomplished a great deal until about 2 days later the mail started to come in. And among some of the mail that we received was a postcard. Dear WOR, I want you to know that I bought my radio to be entertained and not educated.
The National Broadcasting Company formally opened its doors on November the 15th, 1926, with a gala broadcast. Even by today's standards, every important entertainer was included. Actually, there were 2 NBC networks, owned by the Radio Corporation of America and leasing its long lines from AT&T. The red, with WEAF in New York, and the blue, with WJZ. The names were adopted from a map of the United States, which some engineer marked up with colored pencils. The inaugural broadcast of CBS came in 1927. But both its programs and its financial backing were somewhat more modest. The debut in rented studios is recalled by the conductor, Howard Barlow.
The first day of broadcasting was the Sunday afternoon, the 18th of September, 1927, at 3 o'clock. and it was in the studios of WOR down on Broadway. The equipment in the studio was very primitive. Consequently, the control room was separated from the studio by one single door with a single glass in the door. The control man, the knob twister, threw me the cue through the glass door, and I, in turn, threw the cue to Andy White, who was the famous sports announcer of his day, who, in turn, started the dissertation on Columbia Broadcasting System. Well, the talk lasted a little longer than we thought it would. I began inventing right then at the first broadcast signals for ending pieces before they were supposed to end. And I couldn't edit Andy White because he was determined to talk, and I was just as equally determined to play. So when we got near the end of the program, I saw that we were going to run over, so since I was going to conduct the next program anyway, I just found a good place to end the piece we were playing. I forgot now what it was. And we ended, and then Major White signed us off of the first program, and Harry Brown came in and introduced the second program, which was the Cathedral Hour, which was all religious music. And we had then 6 singers on our staff. That was to be our Cathedral Hour. And that ended at approximately 5 o'clock. I didn't feel it was very religious to end a religious song abruptly the way I had ended some of the other songs. So I finished the piece that I was playing, and we brought the second program to a close.
And here, ladies and gentlemen, is your old friend Ben Burney with one of your most requested favorites, Fascination. Network radio meant a big investment and high-priced talent and programs planned months in advance. There was the famous Eveready Hour, the Maxwell House Hour, the Amphico Hour, and the Palmolive Hour, the City Service Orchestra and the Clico Club Eskimos, and the Ipana Troubadours. Many of those programs I had the pleasure of announcing. And I might add that a lot of the local programs bit the dust. Most of those ladies who played the piano for so many hours on radio went back to giving music lessons at night. And you know, it is really amazing to sit in your living room in the evening and hear a band playing 1,000 miles away. Now we've heard a program live from the moon, and we take the speed and agility of radio for granted. But in those days, I can tell you, people were thunderstruck. And when you said you were a radio announcer, they stared at you as if they couldn't believe that the voice coming out of the receiver actually had a body attached to it. Some of the biggest entertainers of those days were right off the bandstand or the vaudeville stage.
Happy days are here again, the skies above are clear.
Rudy Valley, for instance, Al Jolson.
Don't cry. A little choo-choo train that takes me away from you. No words can tell how bad it makes me.
The smooth, jazzy arrangements of Paul Whiteman's orchestra. Sir Harry Lauder.
Oh, it's very nice. Yes, it's very, very nice to get your breakfast in your bed on Sunday morning.
Fanny Bryce, before she became Baby Snooks. Will Rogers.
I read an Irish paper the other day and says liquor is 18 cents a quart. Can you imagine a nation wanting more freedom than that?
The Coon Sanders Nighthawks.
Eyes like searchlights in the night, gorgeous teeth and snowy white. Take a look, here comes my ball and chain. She's a funny gem to me, tons of personality. Take a look, here comes my ball and chain.
And a youthful singer named Eddie Cantor. I'll get back to him later on.
Another sunny honeymoon, another season, another reason for making whoopee.
And starting about 1928, you could also hear two comics who would get top ratings for the next decade, although they didn't have ratings for many years to come. They started out as Sam and Henry on WEBH, the Edgewater Beach Hotel in Chicago, in 1925.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Uh-oh.
Over. Accosted as I used to making speeches, I want to say a few words to the good brothers here tonight. When I was a little boy, how was that, Henry?
Keep on, don't turn around.
Accosted as I used to making speeches.
You was crazy.
Accosted as I used to making speeches, you was crazy.
I understand that even President Coolidge didn't like to be disturbed when Amos and Andy were on. The public was so fascinated with radio in those days that even the announcers got to be celebrities. We were all very careful of the way we spoke, and we were picked for our voices to begin with. And a lot of listeners, particularly lady listeners, seemed to think we were speaking to them alone. Graham McNamee, I know, had a terrific following. So did Boke Carter and Phillips Carlin. And Andy White. And I, too, got some fan mail and some offers I wouldn't dare to repeat in public. Oh, it is flattering. Then a little frightening, too, to think that so many people were hanging on your every word. Also, I have to admit that in the early days, radio was a little on the, well, stuffy side. To tell you just how stuffy, here's someone who began at NBC in New York the same year that I did. Ben Grauer.
All staff people had to wear tuxedo after 6 p.m. The dominant note was one of cautious formality with the listener. The doctrine was that you were a guest in the home. It was, you can understand it if they came out of a kind of a rigid doctrine of decorum and courtesy and correctness. This was the thing to do. And this was even reflected in the broadcaster's work. The earliest hosts or masters of ceremonies were very square. They had to be. The idea was that you were the spokesman for this dignified, responsible, highly ethical corporation. They weren't sure of themselves and in the new medium to take chances or to fool around or to loosen up. It was ceremonial rather than creative.
Again, it is the pleasure of the Perfect Circle Company, manufacturers of Perfect Circle piston rings, to present Charlie Davis and his famous Indiana Public Stage Orchestra. These programs of the best in popular music are especially arranged for your entertainment by Mr. Davis and the Perfect Circle Company. Whenever you buy anything, whether for your personal use or for your home or for your car, there is an undeniable feeling of satisfaction in the knowledge that it is a standard product, widely and favorably known. Perfect Circle piston rings are the standard of the automotive industry, used by more than 80% of America's car manufacturers in all or a large part of their production. When your car exhibits any one of the symptoms that show the need for new piston rings, you can depend on good results if you tell your garage man to install a complete set of Perfect Circle oil regulating and compression rings. The orchestra greets you tonight with Mean to Me.
The first fight to be broadcast was way back in 1921 between Jack Dempsey and Georges Carpentier, but nothing equaled the heavyweight championship fight of 1927, when Gene Tunney stayed on the mat for what seemed to be longer than 10 seconds and then got up to win the fight. Also, I think this is the first fight to be recorded.
My best sports memory is the first Rose Bowl game.
This is Carl Haviland, retired president of Broadcast Music Incorporated and commercial manager of station KFI in the 20s.
And I went to the Tournament of Roses, 1927, and arranged with them to carry the Rose Bowl game. Then I telephoned the National Broadcasting Company, I think it was Phillips Carlin, and he said, an exceedingly good idea, we'll take it, and we're going to send Graham McNamee out. And I went down and told Mr. Anthony that Mr. McNamee, who was a legendary name, we'd never seen him, but we'd heard him, and this great voice was coming out. And Mr. Anthony, after I'd left the office, called the network back and said, it's okay to bring out McNamee, but Carl Haviland's got to split the game with him. Well, of course, you can realize what New York thought about that. Haviland, who is Haviland? This game went off very well, and he was an enthusiast. He was a lyric, bardic sort of person, an Irishman, a poet at heart, and he painted with a broad brush because he wanted to convey to you his enjoyment. And this was marked the next year. He came again, but next year it rained. And so he said to me, don't mention that it's raining. I kept saying to him when I could get his ear, Graham, we can't keep up this. He said, look, I am running this broadcast. It is not raining. We went all the way through this parade while they talked of the organdy dresses, the fresh, beautiful flowers, and the girls were bedraggled. And he taught me a lesson then. In other words, radio is what the man at the microphone wants it to be.
Ladies and gentlemen of the radio audience, this is Graham McNamee speaking from the Navy Yard, Washington, D.C. Just a moment ago, the last turn of the propellers of the Memphis brought her close into the dock. The entire white uniformed crew of the Memphis is now lined up at attention, awaiting Lindbergh. Lindbergh is coming down the gangplank. Here's the boy.
50 stations carried the return of Lindbergh on June 11th, 1927, after his famous transatlantic flight. But another hero returned 3 years later, after an adventure that lasted longer than a year, and that's where I came in. I was at WGY in Schenectady in 1928 and 1929, working on shortwave and experimental television. Oh, yes, they were working on TV as early as then. Every Saturday night, either I or someone from KDKA would broadcast to Commander Byrd at Little America, Antarctica. And we got to be quite good friends, though we had never actually met. Now, when Byrd came back in June of 1930, NBC chose me to come to New York and go out on a seagoing tug and meet him. We didn't know just exactly where he was because the New York Times, which sponsored his expedition, didn't release his exact position. We met him early in the morning, somewhere off Cape Hatteras. I spoke to him across the water which separated our ships with a megaphone, and he recognized my voice, and they put me aboard his flagship, the City of New York. And let me tell you, we got quite a welcome in New York Harbor a couple of days later. Radio's first decade was a good one. In 1924, more than $350 million were spent on radios and tubes and related hardware. In 5 years, that figure would more than double. And furthermore, car radios began to appear. RCA stock went up 600% in a year and a half in the late 20s. CBS stock didn't go that high, but the network did achieve solvency, thanks to the efforts of Bill Paley. Radio listening, particularly in the evening around the living room set, was becoming a habit for millions of families. A habit that would last as long as network radio.
We offer one who has the will